Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Leslie was forced to confront the crumbling foundation of her carefully constructed life, a life built on deception, manipulation, and the quiet belief that no one would ever unravel her secrets. What began as a calculated arrival into the town alongside Eva had slowly spiraled into something darker, something that even Leslie herself had not anticipated. When Leslie first stepped into this town, she carried herself with the poise of someone who believed the world belonged to her. She orchestrated her own entry with precision, dragging Eva into the stage as both ally and cover. But her ambition was ruthless. She did not hesitate to harm Nicole's trusted assistant, eliminating a barrier so Eva could slip neatly into the vacant spot. To Leslie, this was strategy, an opening move in a game where only she knew the rules. Yet the consequences of that cruelty had rippled outward. Nicole's assistant had been more than a disposable pawn. Her downfall became the first loose thread that others would later tug at, unspooling the facade Leslie had worked so hard to stitch together. The town had never been an easy place to blend into. Beneath its picturesque surface were endless undercurrents of suspicion, quiet rivalries, and unspoken alliances. Leslie underestimated this. She thought her wealth, her charisma, and her relentless willpower would be enough to shield her from scrutiny. But soon, Laura nearly lost her life after surviving 2 separate attacks events Leslie never anticipated would circle back to her. She believed her machinations invisible, buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. Yet those attacks marked her like fingerprints on glass. People whispered, piecing together timelines, and Laura's haunting gaze seemed to linger on Leslie every time they crossed paths. For Laura, survival came at a price. She lived in constant fear, knowing danger stalked her more than once, but she also carried a sense of unfinished justice. She never knew for certain who orchestrated the chain of violence against her, but her suspicions clung to Leslie like a shadow. And when whispers reached Bill, whispers about accidents that seemed more deliberate than chance, a storm began to gather. Bill was not a man to be underestimated. Known around town as someone who carried his rage quietly but decisively, he harbored no patience for games. His life had already been fractured by the mysterious disappearance of his daughter and Danny, a wound that bled into everything he touched. Each day without answers was a day his anger fermented, searching for a target. And when Leslie's name floated to the surface, when her smug smile dared to cross his path, he found the focus he needed. One evening, the quiet of Leslie's home shattered when Bill knocked at her door. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor, but the steady pounding of someone who had come to demand what was his. Leslie opened with the same confidence she always carried, draped in wealth, perfume, and the belief that she remained untouchable. She even laughed at the thought of Bill daring to threaten her. Did he not see the empire she had built, the money that silenced critics, the alliances she thought unbreakable? But Bill was unmoved. He did not fear her bank account or the whispers of her supposed influence. His eyes burned with something Leslie rarely encountered: absolute certainty. He told her plainly, he would drive her out of this town, no matter how deep she had dug in. His daughter's disappearance, Danny's vanishing, Laura's pain, all of it swirled into his fury, and he placed Leslie squarely in the center of his crosshairs. What unnerved Leslie was not just the threat itself, but the precision of his words. Bill revealed he had been investigating, pulling apart the loose ends she had left behind. He uncovered the strange details of Laura's accident, the irregularities, the whispers of medical sabotage, the inexplicable surge of potassium in her system that nearly claimed her life. Bill knew, with an almost chilling clarity, that Leslie had engineered it. The moment Laura's name left his lips, Leslie's mask cracked. For the first time, she felt a shiver of genuine fear. Bill was not bluffing. He had evidence, or at least enough to force the law's hand. And with his resolve, he would not stop until every door was slammed shut in her face. He promised her that if she resisted, Laura's case would be reopened, investigated, and prosecuted with ferocity. No lawyer would dare defend Leslie. Not in this town, not with Bill breathing down their necks. She stood silent, her wealth suddenly a fragile shield that could no longer hold back the tide. Bill's words hung heavy in the air, every syllable hammering into her chest. She realized this was not a game she could manipulate, not a threat she could simply outspend. For the first time, Leslie saw herself cornered. Later that night, she sat with Eva, her voice shaking in ways Eva had never heard before. The bravado was gone, replaced by a quiet despair. She told Eva the truth that they had no choice but to leave. The town had become a trap, and Bill was pulling the chains tighter with every passing hour. Yet even in her defeat, Leslie's bitterness seeped through. She confessed her heartache over Ted, a man she had long coveted, a man she believed might anchor her schemes into something more than strategy. But Ted, she now realized, might have only used her as a convenient pawn in his war with Nicole during their divorce. This confession was not merely about heartbreak. It was about the crumbling of Leslie's illusions. She had convinced herself that her actions were steps toward a greater destiny, that every betrayal and manipulation would eventually pay off. But now, she saw the cracks. Ted had played her, Bill had cornered her, Laura had survived against her odds, and Eva, the one person she dragged into this nightmare, was left staring at her with a mixture of pity and fear. The town itself seemed to turn hostile. Where once she believed she moved invisibly, now she felt the eyes of strangers on her everywhere. Conversations paused when she entered a room. The air carried whispers. Her wealth could buy silence for a time, but it could not erase suspicion. Even her allies began to distance themselves, sensing her downfall. As Leslie prepared to leave, every memory of her arrival returned to haunt her. She remembered Nicole's assistant, the first domino she toppled, and how easily she dismissed the consequences. She remembered Laura's near-death experiences, brushed aside as collateral damage. She remembered Ted's smile, the promises that now felt hollow, and the realization that perhaps he had never cared at all. For Eva, the decision to follow Leslie was not simple. She owed Leslie her position, her chance to rise where Nicole's assistant had fallen. But now, she faced the truth: she had been complicit in Leslie's schemes, tethered to a sinking ship. As Leslie spoke of leaving, Eva felt torn between loyalty and survival. Did she truly belong at Leslie's side, or was this the moment to sever ties before the storm consumed them both? The looming departure was not a clean escape. Bill's words echoed like a curse. If Leslie resisted, Laura's case would resurface. That meant even if Leslie left, the ghost of her crimes might still follow. She could run from the town, but could she ever outrun the truth? And then there was the question of Bill's daughter and Danny. Their absence lingered like an open wound in the town, and Bill's fixation on Leslie only deepened the mystery. Was Leslie truly connected to their disappearance, or had Bill's grief simply sharpened into a vendetta? Either way, the perception was enough. Perception, in this town, carried as much weight as fact. Leslie's once unshakable confidence now collapsed under the weight of paranoia. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing. Every unexpected call tightened her chest. She replayed Bill's words endlessly, the promise of destruction if she did not comply. And beneath it all was her gnawing doubt about Ted, the man she had believed would elevate her. Did he laugh at her behind closed doors, amused by how easily she bent to his will? Had she truly been nothing more than a disposable tool? The irony was bitter. Leslie had entered the town believing she could control every narrative, manipulate every relationship, and bend fate to her will. But now she was nothing more than a trapped figure in someone else's story, waiting for the next move to be made against her. The nights grew longer. Conversations with Eva turned into tense debates about what leaving would mean. Could they start fresh somewhere else, or would the shadows of this town follow them forever? Leslie's wealth could buy them a new house, a new life, but not the erasure of guilt. And as much as she tried to mask her fear, Eva saw it clearly. Leslie was breaking. Still, a part of Leslie clung to defiance. She told herself she could still salvage something. She fantasized about confronting Ted, forcing him to admit his manipulation, clawing back the dignity he had stolen from her. She even considered finding a way to silence Bill, to twist the narrative back in her favor. But each plan dissolved under the harsh light of reality. Bill's evidence was too sharp, his resolve too unyielding. The town, once a place Leslie thought she could conquer, had become her prison. Every street corner, every familiar face carried the weight of judgment. And the longer she lingered, the clearer it became that she could no longer control what happened next. Yet even as the walls closed in, A part of Leslie refused to accept defeat quietly. If she was to leave, she wanted something on acknowledgement, a victory, however small. But in chasing that last grasp of power, she risked igniting a fire that could consume everything. The days to her departure ticked down like a silent clock, each hour pressing closer to an inevitable breaking point. And as Leslie looked into Eva's uncertain eyes, she realized she was no longer leading. She was begging. Bill's ultimatum hung over Leslie and Eva like a thundercloud, shaping every decision they made in the days that followed. Yet instead of moving quietly toward departure, Leslie found herself paralyzed by anger and humiliation. She had spent years believing that wealth could insulate her from consequence, that cleverness could outmaneuver even the most watchful adversary. Now she faced the prospect of walking away in disgrace, carrying the weight of failure and betrayal. Eva noticed how restless Leslie became. At night, she roamed the house, pacing like a predator trapped in a cage. Her mind churned over Ted, obsessing about whether his cold manipulation had been intentional from the start or whether she had simply read too much into his fleeting moments of warmth. Each recollection cut deeper, especially when she replayed his calculated advice during his divorce with Nicole. To Leslie, it now seemed so obvious Ted had steered her actions not to help her, but to serve himself, using her ruthlessness to weaken Nicole's support network. Eva, meanwhile, lived in quiet dread. She had hitched her future to Leslie's ambition, but the unraveling had exposed truths she could no longer ignore. Bill's fury was not just a threat, it was a storm gathering momentum, and Eva feared they might both be crushed beneath it. She began to consider the possibility of breaking away, but each time she looked at Leslie, she felt tangled by a loyalty and pity. Leslie had given her opportunities she never would have seized alone. But at what cost? Bill's investigation did not stop with Laura's accident. His grief over his missing daughter and Danny pushed him to search deeper, turning over every stone. While no concrete evidence tied Leslie to their disappearance, the more Bill studied her past, the more convinced he became that she was at least tangentially responsible. He reasoned that someone who could manipulate her way into positions of power, harm Nicole's assistant without hesitation, and orchestrate Laura's near death was also capable of darker deeds. His obsession sharpened into purpose. Removing Leslie was not just revenge, it was a way to protect the town itself. Laura, recovering slowly from her traumas, lived in constant unease. Though she was no longer in immediate danger, the knowledge that someone had deliberately targeted her weighed heavily. When Bill approached her with his suspicions about Leslie, she felt both relief and terror. Relief that someone finally believed what her instincts had whispered all along, and terror because naming Leslie as the one behind it might reignite the violence she had narrowly survived. Still, she shared details with Bill, small inconsistencies, moments that had always unsettled her, the way Leslie's eyes lingered too long whenever they crossed paths. The closer Bill drew to the truth, the more desperate Leslie became. She realized that leaving town might not erase the danger if Bill had already gathered enough evidence. Her wealth could shield her in another city, but scandal had a way of crossing borders. And then there was Eva. To abandon Eva would mean severing the last tether to her own humanity, yet to take Eva along meant dragging her into permanent exile. As days stretched on, Leslie's paranoia deepened. She began to imagine scenarios where Ted and Bill secretly collaborated, each playing a role in stripping her of power. She wondered if Nicole herself had been feeding them information, orchestrating a slow revenge for the destruction of her assistant and her marriage. Though Eva tried to calm her, Leslie's mind spun out of control, interpreting silence as conspiracy and coincidence as proof. Bill, however, did not care for games of the mind. He pressed harder, speaking openly in town about what he knew. His words spread, planting seeds of suspicion among the townspeople. Suddenly, Leslie found doors closing where they had once been open. Former allies avoided her gaze, invitations to gatherings evaporated, and whispers grew louder. Even without a trial, the court of public opinion had already begun to exile her. Laura's situation mirrored Leslie's unraveling in reverse. Where Leslie's influence diminished, Laura's resilience slowly restored her place in the town. She became a quiet symbol of survival, someone whose endurance through 2 attacks earned her sympathy and protection. People gravitated toward her story, asking questions, listening closely, piecing together narratives. Though Laura never publicly accused Leslie, her silence was interpreted as tacit acknowledgement that Bill's suspicions were justified. The intersection of these lives created a pressure point, and the tension simmered toward confrontation. Bill prepared his final push, a meeting with Leslie that would end her hesitation once and for all. He was no longer content with warnings. He intended to force her departure by any means necessary. On the night he arrived again at her doorstep, Leslie greeted him with trembling hands hidden behind practiced calm. Eva lingered in the background, watching the two collide like opposing storms. Bill did not raise his voice, but his words carried the weight of a hammer striking steel. He reminded Leslie of Laura's suffering, of the unanswered questions surrounding his daughter and Danny, of the irreversible damage her presence had caused. His demand was simple: leave, or face public ruin and legal annihilation. Leslie tried to counter with money, donations, even investments that could buy Bill's silence. But Bill's anger was beyond purchase. He rejected every offer, his jaw tightening, his eyes unblinking. He told her plainly that no amount of wealth could restore what she had taken from him. For the first time, Eva saw Leslie collapse, not physically, but emotionally. Her voice cracked, her mask fell, and the fury that usually defined her turned to desperation. She admitted her fear of losing Ted, her disgust at being manipulated, her shame at dragging Eva into a spiral she no longer controlled. In that moment, Leslie seemed more human than ever, but it was too late. Bill had already judged her, and nothing she said could alter his verdict. The following days became a blur of preparations. Leslie began packing, her once opulent home now filled with boxes and silence. Eva watched as the woman who once believed she owned the town now shrank into its corners, avoiding the eyes of neighbors, shrinking from the spaces she had once dominated. Every goodbye felt like a condemnation, every lingering look a reminder of her downfall. Yet one question remained unresolved: Ted. Despite the pain, Leslie could not leave without confronting him. She needed to know whether she had truly been nothing more than a pawn. When she finally sought him out, the encounter was devastating. Ted, cold and unrepentant, confirmed her worst fears. He admitted that her ambition had been useful, her ruthlessness a convenient tool, but beyond that, she meant nothing to him. He had never intended to build a future with her. She was simply leverage in his war against Nicole. The confrontation shattered whatever fragments of pride Leslie had left. Walking away from Ted, she felt hollow, stripped not only of her power but also of her illusions. Her wealth, her schemes, her sacrificed soul of it seemed meaningless when reduced to the truth that she had been discarded like refuse. Eva remained by her side, though doubt gnawed at her. She questioned whether following Leslie into exile was a mistake, whether loyalty had become self-destruction. And yet, in Leslie's brokenness, Eva saw vulnerability, a glimpse of the woman she might have been if not consumed by greed and obsession. It was enough to tether her, though uneasily, to Leslie's fate. Meanwhile, Bill found no comfort in victory. Driving Leslie out of town did not bring back his daughter or Danny. Their absence still haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Laura's gratitude and resilience offered some solace, but his heart remained fractured. He realized that vengeance could not mend loss, yet he also knew the town was safer without Leslie's shadow looming over it. As Leslie and Eva prepared to leave, the town buzzed with speculation. Some believed Leslie would resurface elsewhere, rebuilding her empire with new victims. Others suspected Bill's warnings would haunt her forever, keeping her from ever regaining the confidence she once wielded. Laura, cautious but hopeful, continued her recovery, embodying the quiet strength Leslie had tried and failed to counterfeit. The final hours before Leslie's departure were suffocating. She moved through her house one last time, touching the walls as though saying goodbye to a kingdom lost. Eva stood by the door, bags packed, her face unreadable. Bill watched from a distance, ensuring she truly left, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and lingering sorrow. Laura, though absent, lingered in Leslie's thoughts like an accusation that would never fade. And Ted's rejection echoed in her mind, a wound that would never heal. As the car pulled away from the town, silence fell heavy. Leslie stared out the window, her reflection fractured by the glass. For once, she said nothing. No schemes, No anger, no promises of revenge, only silence. Eva sat beside her, uncertain whether they were running toward a new beginning or fleeing toward an inevitable end. Bill remained behind, his battle won but his war unfinished. His daughter and Danny were still missing, the questions unresolved. Laura fought to rebuild her life, carrying scars both visible and invisible. And Leslie, exiled and broken, carried the weight of every secret, every betrayal, every manipulation, knowing that no distance could truly erase the past. The story did not end with triumph or redemption, but with the lingering tension of unfinished business. Each character carried their own shadow forward, bound together by the choices that had driven them to this point. The gates that once promised opportunity now stood as silent witnesses to ambition, betrayal, survival, and the cost of truth. The road stretched endlessly as Leslie and Eva drove away from the town, silence weaving between them like an unwelcome passenger. Leslie, once a woman who thrived on commanding every space she entered, now sat hollow, her eyes fixed on the blur of lights passing outside the window. Eva gripped the steering wheel with a steadiness she didn't feel, her mind racing with unspoken doubts. They had escaped Bill's fury, but escape did not feel like freedom. It felt like exile. In the quiet hum of the car, Leslie whispered for the first time in hours, "Do you think he'll follow us?" The question revealed a fear she hadn't allowed herself to admit, that Bill's determination might extend beyond the town, that his need for justice could transform into pursuit. Eva didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure. Bill had proven relentless, and though Leslie was no longer under the same roof as his grief, distance might not be enough to end his crusade. Back in town, Bill stood on his porch, staring into the night. The tail lights of Leslie's car had long since vanished, yet his fists remained clenched. For all his victories, the gnawing absence of his daughter and Danny remained unresolved. He wondered if driving Leslie out had been a distraction, a surrogate enemy to channel his grief against. What if the truth about their disappearance had nothing to do with her? What if his obsession had blinded him to other possibilities? These thoughts tormented him, and yet he could not shake the conviction that Leslie carried pieces of the puzzle, even if she never confessed. Laura, meanwhile, tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The scars from her attacks were fading, but the memory of them was imprinted into her bones. The town regarded her as both survivor and symbol, but inside she wrestled with unease. She wondered whether Leslie's departure would truly bring safety, or whether new dangers would fill the void. Laura understood better than anyone how fragile peace could be, and how quickly it could fracture under the weight of secrets. Ted remained untouched by consequence, moving forward with the same cold detachment that had defined him from the beginning. His divorce from Nicole was finalized, his leverage secured, and Leslie Once his most useful pawn was nothing more than a discarded memory. Yet even he felt the faint echo of unfinished business. He had underestimated how deeply Leslie's obsession for him had rooted itself, and though he believed he had severed that tie, the possibility of her return lingered like a shadow he chose not to acknowledge. As weeks passed, Leslie and Eva drifted from place to place, never settling. Wealth afforded them comfort, but not stability. Leslie could not bear to stay in one location long enough to draw attention. She felt hunted, even when no one was chasing her. At night, she dreamed of Bill's unyielding eyes, of Laura's near-death gaze, of Ted's cruel rejection. Eva, exhausted by the constant movement, began to question whether she had traded one prison for another. Her loyalty tethered her to Leslie, but her spirit longed for freedom. The breaking point came when Leslie received an anonymous envelope at their latest temporary home. Inside was a single photograph, Laura in town, smiling faintly as she walked down the street. Scrawled across the back was one word: justice. Leslie dropped the picture, her hands shaking. She didn't know if it came from Bill, from someone else in the town, or from an entirely different enemy. What mattered was the message. She could never truly outrun what she had done. Eva watched as Leslie unraveled further, paranoia consuming her every thought. "Maybe it's not them," Eva said softly one night. "Maybe it's your conscience." Leslie laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. "Conscience is for people who regret. I only regret losing." But even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed the truth. She was haunted. Bill, for his part, had not sent the photograph. Instead, He had immersed himself in new leads, chasing whispers about his missing daughter and Danny. His hatred for Leslie remained, but his focus had shifted. He realized that vengeance could not resurrect the lost. What he needed now was truth, no matter how painful. In the quiet moments of his search, he sometimes wondered if driving Leslie away had only ensured that he would never uncover the full story. Yet he also knew that keeping her close would have poisoned the town further. Laura slowly regained her voice, speaking more openly about her suspicions. Though she never named Leslie directly, the implication was clear. Her survival became part of the town's narrative, a cautionary tale about how ambition and cruelty could hide behind wealth. People began to look at each other differently, wondering who else might be hiding dangerous secrets. Leslie's absence did not erase fear, it transformed it into vigilance. Ted remained the outlier, untouched and unrepentant. He thrived in the void Leslie left behind, his influence stretching quietly as others looked away. Yet beneath his polished exterior, there was a flicker of unease. He knew Leslie was out there, carrying with her the knowledge of his manipulations. If desperation ever pushed her back toward him, she could expose truths that even he could not bury with money. For the first time, Ted felt the faint sting of vulnerability. The true ending unfolded not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow realization that no one had escaped unscarred. Leslie and Eva, bound together by choices that could never be undone, lived in a cycle of fear and flight. Bill, though victorious in driving her away, remained shackled by the unanswered disappearance of his daughter and Danny. Laura, though stronger than ever, carried invisible wounds that would never fully heal. And Ted, outwardly triumphant, lived with the quiet knowledge that the pawn he had discarded might one day return to topple the board. The gates of the town stood silent, a symbol of boundaries both physical and moral. Some believed Leslie's exile had closed them forever, sealing away the corruption she embodied. Others believed the gates had only opened wider, letting in shadows that had yet to reveal themselves. For Leslie, the final truth became clear on one sleepless night as she sat by a window, staring at a horizon she no longer trusted. She realized that wealth, manipulation, and ambition had never truly given her power. They had only painted her into a corner, making her a prisoner of her own schemes. She whispered to Eva, almost as a confession, "We're not running from them anymore. We're running from me." Eva, weary and silent, finally understood. The story was not about escape or survival, but about consequence. And no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many towns they left behind, Leslie's past would follow like a shadow that refused to fade. In the end, there was no neat resolution, no redemption urn, only the haunting reality that choices carry weight, and that some gates, once crossed, can never be closed again.